Right now, on the deck of a carrier group somewhere in the Arabian Sea, engines are turning. Pilots are being briefed on coordinates they've never been given before. And in Washington, one man has already signed off on the order. Tonight, Iran's oil is the target. August 1st, 2026. And somewhere between Camp David and the Pentagon, a decision has already been made that could send oil prices into freefall panic and turn Iran's economic lifeline into a wall of fire. This is not a rumor whispered in back channels anymore. This is a confirmed order, sitting on the desks of American military planners with a deadline attached to it this weekend. For 5 months, the world has watched a war grind on in the shadows of the Persian Gulf, a war most people back home barely register between headlines about the economy and the midterms. But this weekend is different. This weekend, according to multiple U.S. officials briefed on the plans, President Trump has ordered the military to prepare an assault aimed squarely at the one thing Iran cannot survive losing: its energy infrastructure, oil refineries, power plants, the arteries that keep the Islamic Republic breathing. Let's rewind, because to understand why this moment is different, you need to understand what came before it. In February of 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated strike on Iran, a strike so precise, so devastating, that it eliminated Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, within hours. That single decapitation strike didn't end the war, it ignited it. What followed was 5 months of missile exchanges, drone raids, and a slow-motion economic collapse that has dragged half the Middle East into the blast radius. Now translate the diplomatic language, because that's where the real story hides. When a White House press secretary says Iran will continue to pay until they come to the table in a meaningful way, what she's really saying is the bombing isn't stopping, and there's no timeline for mercy. When Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz says Israel very much wants to strike Iran's energy targets, what he's really telling you is that Israel has been begging Washington for the green light on this exact scenario for weeks, and Washington has been the only thing standing in the way. That restraint appears to be evaporating. According to reporting from CBS News and the Wall Street Journal, the coming operation is being described, in the words of officials directly briefed on it, as the largest bombing campaign of the entire war. Not a retaliatory strike, not a limited response to a single provocation, a calculated, sustained assault on the economic core of a nation already gasping for breath. And here's the number that should stop you cold. U.S. Central Command has reportedly prepared not one, but 2 competing war plans. One is a 2-week bombardment campaign targeting Iran's remaining missile and drone sites, a slow strangulation. The other, favored by some inside the administration, is a shorter, more violent salvo, a knockout blow aimed at breaking Tehran's will to fight in a matter of days rather than weeks. Sources say planning for the harsher option has picked up momentum in recent days. That phrase alone should tell you which way the wind is blowing. Why now? Follow the money, because war, in the end, always comes back to money. Brent crude has been swinging wildly for months, spiking above $100 a barrel during earlier escalations before sliding back as ceasefire rumors circulated. As of this week, WTI crude has been pushed above $86 a barrel purely on the anticipation of these new strikes. ExxonMobil and Chevron alone reported a combined 26 and a $500 million in second quarter profits, a staggering figure that exists only because this war has turned energy markets into a casino. Every explosion in Tehran is a dividend for oil executives in Houston. Every refinery fire in the Gulf is a line item on a shareholder report. But here's the trap Trump is walking into, and it's the same trap that has held the U.S. back from targeting Iranian energy infrastructure for months. If American and Israeli jets hit Iran's refineries hard enough, Iran's own playbook says it will respond by striking the refineries of its neighbors. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, nations that host American troops and are drenched in oil money the entire global economy depends on. This isn't theoretical. It has already happened. In March, Iranian drones and missiles tore into Kuwait's largest refinery, hit Bahrain's Sitra refinery, struck at Saudi Arabia's Ras Tanur facility, and set fuel tanks ablaze at Kuwait International Airport. The fires you're picturing right now, they already happened once. The only question is whether this weekend triggers round 2 at a scale nobody has seen yet. There's a phrase intelligence analysts use quietly in briefings like this: escalation dominance. It means whoever is willing to go further, faster, controls the pace of the war. For months, Washington held back specifically because it feared losing that control, feared that hitting Iran's energy sector would hand Tehran an excuse to torch the entire Gulf's oil supply in retaliation. That fear hasn't disappeared. It's just been outweighed by something else. Political pressure at home, a war that's dragged on far longer than anyone in the administration expected, and a president who, according to officials in that Friday cabinet meeting, looked reporters in the eye and said 5 words that are now echoing through every Pentagon briefing room. We'll be hitting them very hard. there's another number worth sitting with. That shipping index we mentioned, the one measuring how much cargo is actually willing to risk. The region has already collapsed to less than half its wartime peak. Insurance premiums on tankers transiting anywhere near the Gulf have climbed into territory normally reserved for vessels sailing through active war zones, because quite literally they are. Every additional strike this weekend adds another data point to that spiral, another reason for shipping companies to reroute, another reason for insurers to price the risk even higher. War doesn't just burn refineries. It burns the invisible infrastructure of trust that keeps global trade moving, and that kind of damage takes years to repair even after the missiles stop. What happens in the next 48 hours could either force Iran to the negotiating table or push the entire region into an energy war nobody can contain. And the aircraft are already moving. If this kind of real-time military breakdown is exactly what you come here for, hit that subscribe button right now, because we're tracking this war as it unfolds, hour by hour, strike by strike. Drop a comment telling me where you think this goes. Negotiated surrender or full-blown regional oil war. Now, let's go inside the target list itself. To understand what hitting Iran's energy infrastructure actually means in practical terms, you have to understand what's already been destroyed and what's still standing. Because this isn't the first time refineries have burned in this war. It's the second act of a play that already had a devastating first act back in March, when Israel broke ranks with its own ally and unleashed a strike that stunned even the Americans, who were supposed to be coordinating it. Here's what happened, and it matters, because it's the blueprint for what could unfold this weekend. In early March, Israel struck roughly 30 Iranian fuel depots in a single overnight campaign. The images that emerged were almost apocalyptic, thick black smoke, swallowing the skyline of Tehran, flames visible for miles, an entire capital city waking up to find the sun blotted out by its own burning oil reserves. According to Axios, the strikes went so far beyond what American officials expected that the reaction inside U.S. defense circles was summarized in two blunt letters: WTF. Israel had notified Washington in advance, technically fulfilling the alliance's coordination requirements. But the scale, the sheer number of targets hit in one night, blindsided even America's own military planners. Translate that moment, because it tells you everything about the fractures inside this coalition. When a senior U.S. official tells a reporter, on condition of anonymity, "We don't think it was a good idea," what he's really saying is that the two most powerful militaries in this war don't fully trust each other's judgment even as they fight side by side. Trump, according to that same reporting, didn't like the optics either. He wanted, in the words of one of his own advisors, to save the oil, not burn it, because nothing reminds American voters of a failing presidency faster than a spike at the gas pump heading into a midterm election cycle. That tension between military logic and economic politics has defined this entire war, and it's exactly why this weekend's operation is being watched so closely. Because if Trump himself has now ordered strikes on energy infrastructure, the very thing he reportedly discouraged Israel from doing just months ago, that's not a minor shift in strategy. That's a president who has run out of other options and decided the economic risk of higher gas prices is now smaller than the political risk of a war that refuses to end. Now picture the map, because geography is the entire ballgame here. Iran's most valuable energy assets, its major refineries and export terminals, sit clustered around the Persian Gulf coastline and inland near Tehran itself. Facilities processing and storing the crude that keeps Iran's war machine and its economy alive. Destroy enough of them, and you don't just inconvenience Tehran, you starve. Its ability to fund missiles, drones, and the proxy militias. It's leaned on throughout this conflict. But Iran doesn't fight back with symmetry. It fights back with asymmetry, and its favorite weapon has become the tanker and the strait. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes every single day, has been largely blocked by Iran in retaliation for earlier strikes. Reuters and maritime monitors have confirmed Iran's Revolutionary Guard has struck and halted oil tankers attempting to transit the strait, while others have simply turned back rather than risk the crossing. Just this week, a tanker was hit by an unidentified projectile off the coast of Oman, near that same choke point, a chilling reminder that the shipping lanes themselves have become a battlefield. And it's not just the strait. The Houthis, Iran's allies in Yemen, have reportedly discussed imposing fees, essentially a toll, on commercial ships crossing the southern Red Sea after already declaring a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia. Layer that on top of Hormuz, and you begin to see the shape of Iran's real strategy. If we're going down, we're taking global shipping down with us. The economic numbers are staggering. Global shipping through the region has cratered, with one industry index that peaked near 3,700 points in March collapsing to under 1,900 by July, less than half its wartime high. Airlines have rerouted flights around the entire Middle East, adding hours and fuel costs to journeys, while airports handling roughly 15% of global air traffic sit closed or severely restricted. Kerosene and jet fuel prices have more than doubled. This isn't an abstract geopolitical story anymore. It's baked into the cost of a plane ticket, a gallon of diesel, a shipping container crossing the ocean. So when planners in Washington talk about hitting Iran's refineries this weekend, they're not just weighing military targets. They're weighing whether they can survive the retaliation that follows. Another wave of tanker strikes, another blockade threat, another spike that voters will feel at the pump within days. It's a bet that the pain inflicted on Tehran will outweigh the chaos it unleashes on everyone else. And if the last 5 months have taught us anything, it's that Iran's retaliation rarely stays contained to where you expect it. There's a pattern hidden in Iran's targeting choices that deserves a closer look because it isn't random. When Israel struck Iran's South Pars gas field, one of the largest natural gas reserves on the planet, Tehran didn't simply return fire against Israeli soil. It fanned out across the entire Gulf, hitting Ras Laffan in Qatar, the world's biggest gas hub, along with facilities in Kuwait and Abu Dhabi. Translate that decision. Iran was signaling that, if its energy sector burns, it intends to make sure every energy-producing neighbor feels the heat, too, spreading the economic pain so no single nation, including the United States, can absorb the shock in isolation. That's not blind retaliation. That's a deliberate strategy of shared suffering designed to turn Gulf allies into reluctant advocates for a ceasefire, simply because they can't afford another night. Responsibility for triggering. But 5 months is a long time for restraint to hold under pressure, and every week this war grinds on without a decisive outcome, erodes a little more of that caution. What was once an unthinkable escalation in March has by August become the plan sitting on the president's desk. Let's talk about the jets themselves, because behind every headline about strikes and energy infrastructure, there's a machine of extraordinary scale grinding into motion, one most people never see until the missiles are already in the air. U.S. Central Command's area of responsibility stretches across a staggering swath of the Middle East, and for months now it has been quietly building the largest air posture the region has seen since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Refueling tankers, the unglamorous workhorses of any air campaign, have been running near constant. Sorties, aircraft like the KC-135 Stratotanker, spotted just weeks ago meeting F-16 Fighting Falcons midair to keep strike packages fueled deep into hostile airspace. Every fighter jet you see heading toward Iran tonight has, in some sense, already been in the air for hours before it ever crosses. Into contested territory, refueled, repositioned, and briefed on targets that shift by the hour. Here's the detail that should unsettle you most. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has confirmed publicly at a conference held by Israel's Channel 14 that American fighter jets have been operating from Israeli soil en route to strikes on Iran, and that American refueling aircraft launch from there too. Translate that admission. This is no longer a war where Israel and the U.S. coordinate from a distance. Israeli territory has become an active forward operating base for American air power. That is as close to full military fusion between these two allies as this conflict has ever produced. And it's exactly the kind of detail that could pull other Gulf nations deeper into the crossfire if Iran decides to retaliate against the states hosting American assets. And Iran has not been sitting still. Just this week, Iranian forces launched drone strikes targeting Ahmad al-Jaber Air Base in Kuwait, a facility hosting American fighter aircraft. Iran's military claimed it struck fighter aircraft shelters, satellite communication systems, and equipment storage. Kuwait's defense ministry confirmed detecting hostile drones since dawn and said it intercepted and destroyed them, though falling debris caused some damage. Days earlier, Iran released satellite imagery, unverified by independent sources, claiming to show destroyed F-35 fighter jets at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan. Whether or not that imagery holds up to scrutiny, the message behind it is unmistakable. Iran wants the world, and specifically American taxpayers, to believe its strikes are landing on the most expensive aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. This is the psychological war running parallel to the physical one. Iran downed a U.S. F-15 earlier in the conflict, with American forces scrambling to recover the surviving crew member while searching for the second. Moments like that ripple through military morale in ways body counts on paper never fully capture. Every downed aircraft is a headline Tehran can use to claim it's still standing, still capable of drawing blood from the most powerful military machine on Earth. Now picture the cornered leadership on both sides, because that's ultimately what's driving this weekend's decision. In Tehran, whoever now sits atop the Iranian command structure since Khamenei's death in February is operating under existential pressure, a nation with its energy infrastructure already scarred, its currency in free fall, its population enduring blackouts and fuel shortages, yet still finding ways to strike back against far wealthier, far better equipped adversaries. Desperation breeds unpredictability, and unpredictability is exactly what keeps war planners in Washington up at night. In Washington, Trump faces a different kind of cornering. Public approval of his handling of the war and the economy has been sliding for months, according to polling cited by multiple outlets, with midterm elections looming in November. A war that was supposed to demonstrate decisive American strength has instead dragged into its sixth month, rattling gas prices, disrupting air travel, and providing a convenient talking point for every political opponent watching from the sidelines. When a president says, almost pleadingly, at some point they're going to say we just can't take it anymore, that's not the language of a leader executing a plan with total confidence. That's the language of a man hoping one more escalation finally forces the outcome months of bombing haven't achieved. This is the trap of modern air campaigns. Every strike is meant to be the one that breaks the enemy's will. But wars rarely end on schedule, and every previous round of final pressure in this conflict, the decapitation strike in February, the fuel depot strikes in March, the heavy wave earlier this week, was supposed to be decisive. None of them were. Which raises the uncomfortable question hanging over this entire operation. What happens if this weekend's strikes aren't decisive either? Consider the scale of the air bridge that has to function flawlessly for any of this to work. Every strike package flying toward Iranian airspace depends on a chain of support aircraft that never appears in the headlines, tankers, surveillance planes, electronic warfare jets jamming Iranian radar, search and rescue helicopters on standby in case another pilot goes down like the F-15 crew did earlier this year. One broken link in that chain, one intercepted communication, one missed refueling window can turn a routine. Sortie into the next viral image of American wreckage on Iranian soil. CENTCOM's planners know this. It's why officials describe momentum building for weeks before a single missile leaves the rail, because campaigns this size are not decided overnight. They're rehearsed, restaged, and reapproved, until the risk calculus finally tips toward action. And that's precisely why this weekend feels different from every earlier round of strikes in this war. This isn't a rushed retaliation ordered in anger after a single attack on a U.S. base. This is a deliberately built campaign, one central. Command has apparently been holding in reserve, waiting for the exact moment when the political will in Washington finally matched the military readiness in the Gulf. That moment, according to nearly every outlet reporting on this story, has arrived. So where does this leave us standing? Here, on August 1st, watching the countdown to what officials are calling the largest bombing campaign of the entire war, let's put the pieces together, because the picture that emerges is one of a conflict teetering on the edge of something far larger than anything we've seen in the last 5 months. First, the diplomatic track is not entirely dead, and that matters more than the headlines suggest. Despite the drumbeat toward new strikes, reports indicate progress has been made on efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, with dozens of countries, notably excluding the U.S. and Israel, pushing for a resolution to keep global oil flowing. Trump himself has publicly said reopening the strait would take a little more time, but would ultimately be easy. That statement is worth translating carefully. It suggests that even as the president authorizes another round of devastating strikes, he still believes there's an off-ramp available, one where economic normalcy returns once Iran is sufficiently pressured. Whether that's strategic confidence or wishful thinking may only become clear in the coming days. Second, watch the Gulf states, because they are the pressure valve in this entire equation. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, and the UAE have spent months absorbing collateral damage from a war they didn't start and can't fully control. Intercepting missiles meant for American bases on their soil, extinguishing fires at their own refineries, watching their airspace closed and their economies bruised by a conflict between two other powers. If this weekend's strikes trigger the kind of retaliation Iran unleashed back in March and April, these are the nations that will burn again. And their patience with hosting American military infrastructure could finally begin to fray. That's a scenario nobody in Washington wants to contemplate. A coalition partner quietly deciding the cost of hosting U.S. forces has become too high. Third, and this is the number that should stay with you long after this video ends, American energy companies have already banked over $26 billion in profit from a single quarter of this war. That's not a coincidence born of chaos. It's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath every strike, every barrel price spike, every headline about Iran's refineries burning. Somewhere, every single time, smoke rises over Tehran or Kuwait or Haifa, a boardroom somewhere else quietly benefits. War in the 21st century has never been cleaner in its violence or messier in its economics. Fourth, consider the human cost that rarely makes it into the strategic briefings. 2 U.S. soldiers dead, 29 wounded from strikes on Saudi soil alone, according to documented casualty figures from this year's conflict. Civilians killed and injured across multiple Gulf nations from falling debris and intercepted munitions. A bridge in Karaj, still under construction, collapsed in a U.S. airstrike, killing 8 people, whose only crime was proximity to infrastructure someone else decided was a legitimate target. These aren't abstract line items. Every escalation this weekend risks adding to that toll on both sides of a war that has already stretched families and nations to their breaking point. So here's the uncomfortable truth this entire story leads to. Whether these strikes happen exactly as reported, whether they're the shorter, more severe salvo some officials favor, or the grinding 2-week campaign others are planning for, one thing is clear: the aircraft are already in position. The fuel is already loaded, and the political will in Washington has finally caught up to the military appetite that's existed for months. Iran's refineries, the very infrastructure that has survived one devastating round of strikes already in March, are about to be tested again, this time under a president who has explicitly ordered the assault himself, rather than merely tolerating an ally's initiative. What happens next depends on variables nobody fully controls. Whether Iran's leadership decides the cost of retaliation against Gulf neighbors is worth the message it sends. Whether global oil markets can absorb another shock without triggering the kind of recession that would make this war even more politically toxic at home, and whether 5 months of bombing has actually degraded Iran's capacity to fight back, or simply taught its military how to survive under fire. One thing is certain: this weekend will not pass quietly. Somewhere over the Gulf right now, as you watch this, engines are running, coordinates are being finalized, and a decision made in a room at Camp David is about to become fire on the ground in Iran. Whether that fire finally ends this war, or simply feeds it, we're about to find out in real time. Zoom out far enough, and this weekend becomes just one more chapter in a much larger story about how modern wars are fought and financed. A conflict that began with a disrupted 15% of the world's air traffic and turned a stretch of ocean barely 30 miles wide, the Strait of Hormuz, into the single most consequential piece of geography on the planet. Every driver filling up their tank, every airline passenger rerouted around a closed airspace, every family in Kuwait or Bahrain or Tehran sheltering from falling debris, they're all living inside the ripple effects of decisions made in rooms none of them will ever see. And that's the part of this story that rarely makes it into a headline. Wars like this don't end with a single dramatic strike, no matter how large the bombing campaign or how many jets fill the sky this weekend. They end, eventually, through exhaustion, when the economic pain, the military cost, and the political risk on all sides finally outweigh whatever goal started the fighting in the first place. Whether this weekend's strikes on Iran's refineries mark the beginning of that exhaustion, or simply another violent chapter before the next one, depends on choices being made right now, in briefing rooms in Washington and Tehran alike, by people whose names most of us will never know. If you want to understand exactly how we got here, from the February decapitation strike that started this entire war to the fuel depot bombing that shocked even America's own generals, go back and watch our full breakdown of the 2026 Iran war, linked right here. And if you believe this conflict is about to reach its breaking point, let me know in the comments below, because this is a story we are not done telling.